Ilona was talking about that she wants to leave him to have better life.
She had left her driver's license, passport, purse, even her toothbrush.
A young mother with family responsibilities. She literally has dropped off the face of the planet.
She told me that she's trying to avoid him because living with him is getting so tough. They were just slowly growing apart.
She's using Tinder. There are potentially other suspects. And it's become apparent very, very quickly that everything is not quite as it seems. Ilona was initially reported missing by her partner, Camille, on the 11th of November, but she'd actually not been seen since the 9th. He said that he's been out for the evening, that he's come home at roughly 11 o'clock. She's indoors and he's gone to bed and that was it, and then he's got up in the morning at 2 o'clock to go to work and she's vanished.
He said he stayed at home and then a few hours later took his daughter to nursery.
Initially, when somebody comes in to report somebody missing, you would start off with things that you know as fact. So when she was last seen, when she was last spoken to, Ilona had a young daughter who was still at home.
A mother doesn't often leave a 3-year-old daughter without notice. That's not something that happens, and it wasn't in Ilona's personality to just leave. So I think there was instantly a feeling of shock and fear as well.
Mothers do abandon their children. However, mothers who have previously been consistent, reliable, don't tend to do that. For mothers like Ilona, this is absolutely out of character.
Ilona and Camille worked at a local chicken factory.
Now, they worked at the same place, but they were on opposite shifts. There's been no contact there.
Ilona hadn't contacted her daughter's nursery.
But perhaps the most telling thing is that her father had moved over from Poland and he was really ill, and she was his sole carer. He's had no contact with her whatsoever. She was meant to be picking up medication for him and she hasn't.
She had left her driver's license, passport, purse, keys, bike, even a toothbrush. Not something that you do if you've left of your own accord. Camille's story was essentially that Ilona had just left. Carrying nothing, wearing the clothes she had been, and that didn't really add up.
She literally has dropped off the face of the planet. A young mother with family responsibilities, and she has just vanished.
Pretty soon after Ilona had gone missing, we started reporting on that. The police and the local media will work together to try and make this case as well known as possible, to refresh anyone's memory.
One of the first steps, and is absolutely critical to any investigation, is establishing a timeline.
Police searched CCTV in the local area just to see where she had been, where was the last time there was any footage of her, and one of those was in a local McDonald's.
Ilona's seen with her little girl Lenka at McDonald's at 4 p.m. that day, so you know for a fact that she's there, you know that she's been there. Police have seen who they believe to be Ilona. They've seen her walking down the street.
She'd been seen via CCTV in the Red Lion Street area at around 11:55 p.m. and then 20 minutes later in Straight Bargate.
This alludes to the night that she's alleged to have disappeared. There's then subsequent sightings over about the next hour, 20-minute interval. That strengthens what Camille is saying about when she left the house.
Police then released the CCTV footage, and this was the first time that we'd seen images of Ilona on that night.
Telephony is important because you can tell who's been speaking to each other through the billing and the call log. So what we know is on the evening of the 9th, Ilona had a 14-minute call with her sister from 10:42 until 10:56 p.m. It transpires she'd told friends and family that the relationship wasn't going well. It had run its course and that she'd told him, as far as she was concerned, it was finished.
She was talking about that she wants to leave him, to have better life, to give better life to their child. I was a close friend of Ilona. We met at work, where we were working together in the food factory. Ilona had a plan to come to England to earn up some money for her studies, and she wanted to be professional vet in the future. Ilona liked to spend time in nature, to spend time with friends, and she was laughing a lot. She liked adventures.
Z Iloną poznałyśmy się na fabryce, na której razem zaczęłyśmy pracować. Po prostu spotykałyśmy się ze sobą w wolnym czasie. Dużo znajomych w tym momencie. Bardzo była pozytywną osobą.
Kamil met Ilona at work first, and that's how they established that friendship.
Zaczęli rozmawiać o rybach i Kamil zaraził chyba Ilonę wtedy tą pasją do łowienia ryb. I tak pociągnęła się ta znajomość dalej.
Weź czy jeszcze ten?
Nie, najpierw pomyśl życzenie też.
No. From the beginning, their relationship was very good. They were very happy, they were caring for each other, and they were in love, and I could see that for sure.
Nikomu nie mów. XXI wiek, wiesz, nikt się nie patrzy, wszyscy wiecie, ale...
When the baby came along, they started to work on opposite shifts, and they never had any days off together. So they were missing time together and just slowly growing apart. I think their life was getting much harder for both of them because they were struggling with money.
Becoming a new parent puts so much pressure on a relationship. You are going to have to prioritise the needs of that little one over your own needs and over the needs of your partner. And working a long shift and then coming back and being responsible for childcare, that's difficult. It's really, really hard work.
He was always coming back from work and smoking weed, and it was getting like addiction for him.
I think what is interesting is what Camille was trying to mask by his addiction to marijuana. And that was really angry thoughts, feelings and behaviours. When he's not under the influence of marijuana, that's when the anger resurfaces.
Wspólnie to raczej przemocy takiej fizycznej nie było. Raz była sytuacja, o której mi Ilona powiedziała. Doszło do jakiejś awantury w domu i Kamil ją uderzył. I Ilona chyba miała wtedy jakiś niepokój.
I don't believe in one-off incidents. I really don't. Because if those one-off incidents aren't addressed and strongly addressed, then they will turn into 2-off incidents, 3-off incidents, 4, 5, 6, 7. Abusers are very adept at making excuses. Domestic abuse is a cycle.
He was very possessive towards her as well. When she wanted to meet with me or with some friends, and she had to ask him for permission. She had to send him photos that she's with me at my house. Actually, almost every time when it was happening.
I think Camille is really feeling the fact that Ilona is not invested in this relationship anymore, so she's slipping away from him.
Ilona ostatni rok miała bardzo ciężki ze względu na to, że jej ojciec zaczął chorować. Ona nie mogła pogodzić opieki nad Lenką, wizyt ojca w szpitalu, badań, pracy. I po prostu już coraz częściej myślała o rozwiązaniu, o zerwaniu z tym wszystkim. Poszłam z nim porozmawiać i zapytałam w ogóle, co się stało. Zaczęłam dopytywać, ale mówię, czy może pokłóciliście się, może jakaś wymiana zdań. Mówi, że nie, po prostu on się położył, a ona zniknęła. Po prostu nie było jej. Wyglądał na bardzo załamanego. Był bardzo smutny. Powiedział, że jak coś będzie wiedział, to da mi znać. Ja po prostu nie dopuszczałam do siebie myśli, że mógłby coś takiego...
Camille seems to be saying all of the right things. And of course, these friends know Camille. And nobody wants to believe that somebody that they know can possibly be involved in the disappearance of their wife. It seems like something you might read about in a newspaper, that it can never happen to you or somebody that you know. But of course, statistically speaking, Camille is the first person that the friends should look at.
Multiple points in the evening, Elena had been messaging a guy that she had wanted to meet up with, who she had met on Tinder.
Rozmawia z nim od południa i jest bardzo pozytywnie nastawiona, że jest bardzo pozytywnym człowiekiem i bardzo dobrze jej się z nim rozmawia.
They were arranging to meet up the following Saturday to play pool in Lincoln.
They're messaging each other. There's quite a quick response because they both want to be meeting each other.
At 11:56, Elena received a message from the guy which read night, and that was followed by a kiss, but there was no reply to that. CCTV showed that she had been in the Red Lion Street area about 11:55 p.m. and then 20 minutes later in straight to Bargate.
But closer examination of that CCTV, it's become quite obvious. The sad reality is it wasn't her. These things happen. The value of doing CCTV far outweighs the chance that it wasn't actually her. What was established as of the 9th of November, Ilona was never heard from again.
Elena's mobile phone was detected as being in Wormgate, but never detected from any other mast away from the house. What you can infer from that is that it never left the house. Police discovered that Ilona had remained in touch with her ex-boyfriend, and they saw on his phone that there was a message between them at 7 p.m. on the 9th. But all messages had been wiped from his phone, bar one message. That was immediately suspicious for the police.
There are potentially suspects, such as the gentleman that she was meant to be meeting and a former partner. He was arrested because he'd been in contact with her. This gentleman that she's engaging with on Tinder, when he was spoken to, it was very, very quickly verified that it was exactly what he said it was, and that they were in the very early stages of contacting each other, and they'd arranged to meet informally in a couple of days, and unfortunately that never happened. So he was ruled out very, very quickly because it was what it was.
Ilona is very open and above board. She tells Camille, well, actually, I've made a dating profile. And I think she's doing this to show him that she's serious and she's got the ability to move on with her life. I imagine that Camille is feeling not only ousted and angry, but also jealous.
Camille's brought in to give a statement as a witness. Now, the crucial thing, it's a very, very well-worn saying, is the ABC of detective work. Assume nothing, believe no one, challenge everything. So you would take Camille's version of events and you would be looking to prove or disprove that, corroborate it, or at the same time disprove it, at which point he would become more of a suspect. The call to her sister finished at 10:56 and Camille claims that he came back at 11 p.m, some 4 minutes later.
From that point, there were no other messages or any kind of communication from Ilona to anybody else.
At 11:56 that night, the gentleman that she's been messaging from Tinder has sent her a message saying goodnight with a kiss after it, and that's gone completely unanswered, which again was hugely out of character.
Camille had said that he had gone to bed as per usual that night and had got up at 2:20 a.m. to go to work, and that was when he found Ilona missing. Or at least that's what he said had happened.
Camille has said that she's taken this box cum pile of £2 coins to provide for her when she left the house. You need an awful lot of £2 coins. It's become apparent very, very quickly that everything is not quite as it seems. It's all started to unravel because the £2 coins were found hidden in a suitcase. Somebody's put them there. There's 2 people in that flat. There's a 3-year-old child and there's Camille. It's not going to be the 3-year-old child. When the search was conducted, there was extensive evidence of blood. There's been very heavy blood staining in the bathroom, but more crucially, evidence of a clean-up in the bathroom, which is not necessarily consistent with the rest of the house. An excessive effort has been made in the bathroom to clean up what has obviously been quite a large spillage, but you can't get rid of it all. There's been significant blood found in and around the sofa in the front room.
The police collected this evidence and they sent it off to be tested forensically.
On top of that, they've then found clothing downstairs in 2 jars that were commensurate with what she was wearing, that have had water added to the jars, which has left a red liquid in the bottom of the jar. Everything taken in its totality has led the police to believe that a murder's occurred, although they haven't got a body. You then have to start going about proving who could have done that. At the same time as Camille had been spoken to as a witness, they've executed a search warrant at his address. There are patches of blood by the couch where he said he was sat on the night that she went missing. The blood has been tested and has come back and confirmed as Ilona's the day that she disappeared. The former partner of Ilona, he'd messaged her. Rather unfortunately for the gentleman concerned, he deleted the messages from his phone, which raised suspicion on behalf of the police.
Ilona's ex was arrested.
But it quickly became apparent that he had a legitimate reason for clearing his phone, and that was because he was planning on selling it.
This was innocent and just Unfortunately, he had done it at this time, and he was subsequently released.
Following the confirmation that the blood was actually that of Ilona's, the following afternoon, the police had enough evidence to charge Camille with murder. The £2 coins that he said she left with are found within the house concealed. Her bloody clothing is found there. There are patches of blood by the couch. The evidence that was there suggested that something very bad had happened within the premises. And the only person that could have realistically done it was Camille.
W pracy, jak mi koleżanka przysłała wiadomość. Musiałam wrócić do domu, nie dostałam takiego szoku.
Everybody were thinking that probably they had some arguments and she just went somewhere to hide from him for a day or two and she will be back. I was thinking that it's not possible how he could do something to her and how he would hide it. For me, it was like, I couldn't imagine that for sure.
Women who are killed after leaving a relationship are usually killed within the first 6 months of having given that news to somebody. So there's a 6-month time frame, if you like, where things are heightened and you are in danger of becoming a victim of the violence of your partner.
At the time Camille was arrested, the police didn't have any other evidence other than what they had found in the flat. They didn't have a body.
That in itself could be problematic when it comes to trial, because ultimately, not only would that give the family closure, but it would still improve the case significantly and prove beyond any doubt whatsoever that she was in fact deceased. The police made extensive inquiries to try and find the body or further evidence.
Tam był cały czas zagrodzony teren, szukali wszędzie. Na wszystkich, w wodzie, w studzienkach, w śmietnikach.
The flat that they had lived in was adjacent to a river, and internet history on Camille's devices had shown that it searched tide times, which it's a quite logical leap to then think that something may have been dumped in that river.
So this is the River Witham where police had been searching, and then Wormgate just over there, which is where Camille and Ilona lived. Whole area down there was cordoned off by police officers.
Camille was questioned about why specifically he'd searched for the tide times for the River Witham, and he came back with a response that it was because he was a keen fisherman, and in actual fact he was, and scattered over an area. Body parts were discovered dismembered in at least 15 pieces, and that 14 were recovered, but the torso was missing. When the parts were recovered, they'd been wrapped in bin liners and then put in a carrier bag, so they would have preserved them slightly. Having said that, they've still been out in the open, so it's not immediately apparent whose they are.
Police had found CCTV footage of Camille cycling in the early hours of the morning of the 11th of November near their home. Police analysed phone masts which showed that on the 11th of November between 3:07 a.m. and 3:08 a.m. Camille's phone was picked up twice in Witham Way Country Park. Camille denied this and said that he was at his flat in Wormgate, and if not, he was just outside smoking weed.
The body is immediately taken to the mortuary where a special post-mortem is undertaken.
My name is David Rouse. I'm a forensic pathologist. I was instructed by the solicitors acting for the defendant and asked to comment and make sure that the pathology is correct.
The identification of Ilona took about a month in total. There were 14 separate components of her body. Since the torso has not been found, I think it's reasonable to assume there was a 15th component somewhere else. Body parts were in bags which had been double wrapped, some had been ripped, so there's a lot of decomposition. The identification of Ilona was through taking the 4th lumbar vertebra and extracting the DNA from that to match that. There's also tattoos. Now, she had 3 tattoos. They would be used, relatives would say, yes, you know, she had a tattoo here, and you match it up.
The material told me that obviously she'd been subjected to quite a violent assault with repeated blows struck mainly to the head with something heavy, with a curved face.
That says that this was a claw hammer or a round-headed hammer. There was sufficient injury to the brain to give that as a cause of death.
It's unusual for a body to be cut up in the way that Lena was, simply because most of the time people use a saw and just chop through the arms and the legs. You normally look for tool marks. There was no tool marks at all, simply because of the way that he had done the disarticulation. What implement was used? Obviously something sharp, but precisely what? No, there's no indication.
That's an incredibly ferocious, angry attack. He's an angry man who is understanding that he can't control this woman anymore and that she is going to leave him.
That was the most shocking thing in my life, I think. That park wasn't the same for me anymore. I was even traumatized to go there, really. I didn't really want to visit that park anymore.
It's bad enough, isn't it, that he should take her life, but then to do this to her body using the skills that he's learned at the chicken factory. It's so grotesque. I know people who have started to dismember a body and then stopped halfway because they don't have the stomach for it. He clearly had a personality that was able to do that. What an absolute insult to her family and friends.
Jak człowiek mógłby zrobić coś takiego i nikt by tego nie widział? I jak to mógł zrobić przy Lence, która była cały czas w domu?
That was very shocking. But on the other hand, I felt like finally I know what really happened.
It's one of the more horrific cases that I've been aware of where there's been a concerted effort to dismember and dispose of her after the fact.
There may be the possibility that the assailant knew what he was doing.
Because he'd worked in an animal processing factory. He knew where to make the cuts. It'd be quite quick.
Always a tinderbox situation when somebody decides to leave an abusive partner. There's a little bit of fuel being added to the fire here because Camille is feeling jealous of the man on Tinder, the ex-boyfriend, and any number of men who might potentially become Ilona's partner in the future.
Camille's trial was initially scheduled for April. However, having found the body in February, the trial was pushed back until September.
Yeah, I attended the court proceedings and covered the trial for the Lincolnshire Echo throughout. It was difficult to forget this one, purely because of the violent nature of it.
Once the trial started, the prosecution would be seeking to undermine the account that Camille was given from the outset. One of the ways that they've done this is by being able to call friends of Ilona, such as a Gosha that came in and gave a very different account to Camille.
O byciu w sądzie nawet nie myślałam, że jeszcze w takiej sprawie, że będę musiała brać udział.
What is absolutely beyond any doubt is that there was no evidence at all that Ilona was seeing other people or had arranged to meet anybody else apart from this one gentleman that she'd been conversing with on Tinder.
Police believed that Camille had seen the messages on Ilona's phone, became very angry, and in a jealous fit of rage had taken a hammer and beaten her to death with it.
Nobody wants to believe that somebody they know who has been a loving partner at some point and is a father to a child is capable of doing such a terrible thing. This attack, it was accepted, was not premeditated, but it was an angry, ferocious attack from an angry, abusive man.
Dr. Biggs, who was the primary pathologist, gave a cause of death as head injuries. You picked up a hammer and struck Miss Golombek at least 7 times to the head. You caused fractures to the right side of the front of her skull. He then went on to say, Dr. Michael Biggs, the Home Office registered pathologist, described the blows as being consistent with the severe end of the spectrum of force and explained to the jury that the impact of any of these fractures would be to injure Ilona's brain, such that she would have been caused sufficient brain injury to render her unconscious or cause death.
The following day, he chopped her up into 15 different pieces and hid them under the floorboards. He had used the skills he gained from working in the chicken factory to essentially butcher her.
I believe that the dismemberment happened in desperation to cover his own tracks. Now, bearing in mind that he also did this whilst his daughter was sleeping in another room. Thank God she didn't wake up, but what a thing to grow up and realise. It's incredibly shocking.
He was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 22 years. The judge said, "You have been convicted of the murder of Ilona Golombek. Yesterday, October 20th, would have been her birthday. You, while your 3-year-old daughter was asleep, picked up a hammer and hit her at least 7 times to the head. You then took steps to cover up your tracks. You lied to her friends and relatives to see if you could save your own skin. This was a brutal and bloody and senseless killing." Camille's emotions were very minimal throughout the whole thing. He basically sat and stared and didn't really show any emotion throughout. Even when he was being sentenced, there was nothing emotive coming from him at all.
At no point has Camille ever admitted what he's done. Ilona's torso has never been found. And just given that little bit of information that would give the family at least the full picture and some closure. Maybe it's too shameful for him to face at this point, but I think that not telling the family is also shameful. But
There are some crimes that enter public memory because they are baffling, some because they are politically explosive, some because the killer seems to vanish into myth before the facts can pin him down, and then there are crimes that remain infamous for a more terrible reason. They force people to confront what human beings can do when cruelty is not accidental, not impulsive, not the byproduct of rage that flares and burns itself out, but a chosen method. A kind of cold craftsmanship. The Toolbox Killer's case belongs to that darkest category. Even now, decades later, the very name feels less like a title and more like a warning passed down through the history of American crime, a shorthand for something so methodically brutal that those who studied it, prosecuted it, or simply heard enough of its details were marked by it. The summer of 1979 in Southern California should have belonged to the ordinary rituals of youth. It should have belonged to warm pavement after sunset, car radios humming at red lights, teenagers leaning against storefront windows and laughing too loudly because the night made them feel older than they were. It should have belonged to freedom in its most innocent form, the freedom of being young and outside and certain, at least for one more evening, that the world was broad and unfinished and still waiting to open. California sold that promise better than almost anywhere. The state glowed in the national imagination. Beaches, boulevards, late sunsets, highways unspooling toward palm trees and neighborhoods whose names sounded like they had been invented to reassure. Even the darkness there could seem softened by sodium street lamps and ocean air, but cities have always contained two lives at once. The one they advertise and the one they conceal. In Los Angeles and the surrounding counties, the freeways carried not only vacation traffic and restless youth, but also men who knew how to make themselves seem ordinary long enough to get close. The sunlit mythology of Southern California had its underside like every other place. Transient people, runaway kids, girls hitchhiking because they had to or because they thought they still could, parking lots that emptied out too fast. Neighborhoods where someone could vanish into a vehicle and leave behind nothing but a momentary confusion no one nearby would fully understand until much too late. That is where the real terror begins in the Toolbox Killer's story. Not with the courtroom, not with the headlines, not with the forensic inventory of pain that would one day horrify detectives and prosecutors, but with the ordinary surface of life before anyone knows what kind of men are moving beneath it. The hook of this case is not simply that Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were sadists, though they were. It is that they moved through a landscape already built to hide danger inside normalcy. They were not specters in some abandoned wilderness. They were men in a van on California streets, traveling through the same summer night as girls who still believed they could get home. Still believed a stranger might only be a stranger. Still believed that danger, if it came, would at least give us some clear signal first. But some danger does not snarl before it strikes. Some danger smiles, offers a ride, makes itself sound casual, temporary, even helpful. That is part of what makes paired killers so unnerving. One man can seem monstrous enough in retrospect. Two men acting together suggests something even more malignant, because cruelty is no longer confined to a single diseased imagination. It becomes collaborative. It becomes social. It becomes a system closed in on itself, with each man giving the other permission to go further. In the Toolbox Killer's case, that collaboration is one of the most frightening truths of all. These were not crimes born from one sudden lapse, one drunken detour, one argument turned fatal. They were built. They were discussed, prepared for, equipped for. The van itself became more than a vehicle. It became a chamber of control, a moving trap disguised as transportation, a private space on public roads where the ordinary rules of the world could be suspended by men who had no intention of allowing mercy to enter. When people later learned why the case carried the name, it did. The word toolbox stopped sounding practical and began sounding sinister. Tools belong to work, to repair, to construction, to the steady hand of someone making or fixing something. In this case, the idea of tools was perverted into something almost unbearable. because it suggested not spontaneous violence, but planned violence. Violence accompanied by objects selected in advance. Violence that imagined suffering as a process rather than an event. That is what makes this case so difficult to approach even in narrative form. One must begin before the full darkness, at the edge of it. Because once the details rush in too quickly, they risk flattening into shock alone. And this story is not only about shock. It is about predation hidden inside modern life. It is about teenage girls navigating a city and its outskirts in the vulnerable borderland between independence and exposure. It is about two men old enough to know exactly what that vulnerability looked like and wicked enough to hunt it. The California of 1979 was a place of movement. Cars mattered. Highways mattered. Distance could be crossed quickly, and that speed gave both freedom and concealment. The suburban sprawl of greater Los Angeles was not a neat city, but a vast arrangement of neighborhoods, commercial strips, canyon roads, parking lots, and beaches, where one could be visible one moment and utterly alone the next. This geography mattered. Predators understand geography the way gamblers understand odds. They notice where young people gather, where police presence thins, where a vehicle can linger without seeming strange, where a girl standing at the edge of a lot or walking a road after dark may be between places and therefore easier to isolate. Bittaker and Norris understood such things. They moved through a region that offered them both access and anonymity. The cruel advantages of urban spread in daylight. Southern California could look like aspiration itself by night. The same streets could become a sequence of missed protections, a bus stop after the last route, a stretch of road where a ride feels easier than the long walk, a beach parking lot where friends separate too soon, a neighborhood where someone assumes a girl must have gotten home already. Predators do not invent these vulnerabilities. They inhabit them. They wait for them. They exploit the small gap between a life safely continuing and a life abruptly taken off its path. The girls targeted in this case were not symbols wandering abstractly into evil. They were teenagers, daughters, friends, young people with familiar habits and half-finished plans. That is another reason the story hits with such force. True horror lies not only in what was done, but in who it was done to. Girls still at the age of curfews, arguments with parents, school breaks, summer nights, shifting friendships, and all the untidy, ordinary things that belong to youth, to predators like Bittaker and Norris. That youth itself was part of the attraction, innocence. In these cases, is not some sentimental glow added by later writers. It is part of the crime. The killers targeted vulnerability deliberately. They looked for girls whose age, circumstances, or temporary isolation could be turned against them. There is a special obscenity in that. Because adolescence is already a period when the world begins asking young women to navigate danger while still offering them very little real power against it. The distance between being treated as old enough to move through the world and not actually being safe in that world can be fatally thin. In 1979, girls hitchhiked, accepted rides, walked stretches of road alone, trusted that if they stayed alert, they could manage the risks. Sometimes that trust held. Sometimes the world rewarded it with nothing worse than an uncomfortable moment. And sometimes, horrifyingly, the wrong vehicle stopped. The hook of the Toolbox Killers case is therefore also a story about the betrayal of the ordinary. A van is supposed to be unremarkable. Two men in a vehicle might seem odd, might seem vaguely off, but not necessarily catastrophic. A conversation through a roll-down window is supposed to remain a conversation. The possibility that it is the opening movement of a nightmare is precisely what most people are not built to assume every time they step outside. Civilization depends, in part, on that assumption. We cannot function if every offer of help, every passing car, every stranger's question is treated as certain doom. Yet predators rely on this same social habit. They rely on the fact that normal life trains people to hesitate before naming danger. A teenage girl does not want to appear rude, paranoid, dramatic, Difficult. She may tell herself she can handle a ride. Judge the situation. Get out if it feels wrong. She may have nowhere else to go quickly. She may simply be tired. Such decisions are made in seconds. Evil often needs only that. By the time the full reality announces itself, control has already shifted. In the case of Bittaker and Norris, that shift was everything. The public roads, the open city, the broad California sky, all of it could vanish the moment a victim crossed the threshold into the van. That threshold is the true doorway into the story. On one side is youth, movement, chance, unfinished plans. On the other is confinement, calculation, and men who have already decided that another person's fear is useful to them. If you listen closely enough to the cultural memory surrounding this case, you can hear that threshold echoing through all of it. Not merely murder, but abduction. Not merely violence, but captivity. Not merely the extinguishing of life, but the slow domination of it first. That is why the case lodged so deeply in law enforcement memory. It was not only the number of victims. It was not only the pair-killer dynamic. It was the sustained intention. The preparation, the way ordinary objects and ordinary motion through the city had been twisted into a private theater of torture. The summer setting makes the story more haunting, not less. Summer has always carried a double meaning in American life. It promises leisure, expansiveness, the illusion that time is looser and nights are generous. For teenagers, it often feels like the season when the boundaries of childhood weaken. You stay out later, you go farther, you take rides, make plans, miss buses, trust one more hour of darkness because tomorrow still seems far away. In California, with its warm evenings and automobile culture, that looseness was magnified. Summer nights invited movement. They invited the small improvisations by which young people live, changing destinations, accepting last-minute lifts, walking from one place to another because the weather makes it feel possible. But looseness cuts both ways. It gives freedom to the innocent and opportunity to the predatory. Bittaker and Norris were moving through that same seasonal atmosphere with a different purpose entirely, where their victims saw summer. They saw access, where their victims saw a ride. They saw selection, where their victims saw one more ordinary interaction. They saw a chance to close the door. There is also something deeply unsettling about the age and bearing of the killers themselves. They were not impulsive teenage offenders or wild-eyed drifters too chaotic to read. They were adult men. Older, experienced, criminally seasoned, able to wear normalcy like a jacket long enough to approach. They carried with them the accumulated damage of prior offenses and prior choices. But what makes this case unforgettable is not biography alone. It is volition. There is no soft, accidental language that can contain what they became together. The phrase paired killers matters because one man's fantasy met another man's willingness. And the result was escalation. The presence of an accomplice can dilute conscience to nothing. Each man sees himself reflected in the other's approval. Each discovers that his ugliest impulse does not have to remain private. Shared depravity has its own momentum. It builds a world inside the partnership. And within that world, the victim becomes less and less a person and more a stage on which power can be exercised. That internal world is hard for ordinary people to grasp because it is built from emotional materials most people spend their lives resisting. Domination, contempt, sadism, dehumanization, and the thrill of total control. Yet to understand the horror of the toolbox killers, one must begin by recognizing that the crimes were not chaotic eruptions from outside human possibility. They were the result of two men constructing, between themselves, a moral vacuum and then carrying that vacuum into the lives of girls who had no way of knowing what kind of void had just stopped at the curb. Before the evidence would be cataloged, before prosecutors would learn how much pain the case could force even hardened professionals to absorb, Before the nation would attach its enduring label to the crimes, there was only that broad California night and the terrible mismatch between what the victims expected from the world and what the killers intended to make of it. That mismatch is the hook. It is the opening wound in the story. Teenagers moving through the ordinary freedoms of summer, two older men turning those freedoms into ambush, a van traveling roads made for mobility but used instead to imprison, a city vast enough to let people disappear for crucial hours before anyone understands, and behind all of it, the slow approach of a truth so ugly that once fully known, it would alter everyone who touched it. This is where the case begins, not in the later language of evidence and sentencing, but at the moment when ordinary life is still trying to go on, still glowing under streetlights and summer heat. While somewhere nearby, a vehicle is already in motion, carrying men who have mistaken another human being's terror for pleasure and another human being's life for material. That is the abyss at the heart of the Toolbox Killers case. And the reason the story still grips the imagination with such dread, it is not only that the crimes were brutal. It is that they moved through the same world as everyone else, close enough to touch. Dressed in the shape of something ordinary, until the door shut and the ordinary ended. Southern California in 1979 lived inside a contradiction it did not fully know how to name. It sold itself as freedom. And in many ways it was. The highways ran like bright arteries through Los Angeles County and beyond, carrying surfers, students, commuters, runaways, dreamers, and bored teenagers from one corner of the sprawl to another. The weather itself seemed to collaborate with the mythology. Even at dusk, the air often stayed warm. The sky lingering in bruised shades of orange and violet long after the sun had dropped behind the horizon. There were beaches where young people drifted until dark. Neighborhoods where summer nights made the streets feel almost festive, and endless boulevards where a person could believe movement itself was a kind of safety. Cars were freedom, a ride was convenience. A late night was ordinary. California had built its modern identity on that open, mobile life. But the same landscape that gave so many people the sensation of possibility also created a particular kind of vulnerability. Sprawl means distance. Distance means isolation. And isolation, in a city large enough to keep swallowing people into its motion, can appear with shocking speed. A girl can be surrounded by noise and neon one minute and standing alone on a dim stretch of pavement the next. A vehicle can stop. A conversation can begin. A decision can be made in seconds. Then the city closes over the moment as though it never happened. That was the context in which the Toolbox Killers moved, and it mattered more than any single grim detail would later suggest. Their crimes did not emerge in a vacuum. They emerged in a place where youth, mobility, anonymity, and urban vastness met one another every night. To understand how Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were able to hunt, one must first understand the world that made their hunting easier to conceal. Los Angeles in the late 1970s was not only glamorous California postcard life, it was also an enormous, fragmented, restless urban organism. There were affluent communities and neglected ones, bright shopping strips and empty industrial corridors, beach towns and inland routes, polished suburbs and pockets where the social fabric had begun to fray. The city was full of people coming and going, full of noise, full of lives crossing without touching. It contained a transient population, runaways, teenagers slipping loose from supervision for a night or a weekend, young people who hitchhiked because they had to, or because it still seemed. Despite the risks, like one more common feature of American youth culture, a girl standing by the road did not automatically trigger alarm in the public mind. That is important. The culture had not yet fully internalized the scale of danger it was willing to impose on young women simply for moving through public space. Girls were expected to be cautious. Yes, but they were also expected to get on with life. Go here. After a wee be you jetting for train here? Come home by then. Stay alert. Be smart. The burden of avoiding predation was placed on them so routinely that it could begin to sound natural, as if the world's violence were simply another chore for girls to manage between school, family rules, and adolescence. That arrangement, unfair as it was, gave men like Bittaker and Norris room to operate. The region's car culture intensified everything. Southern California was built for vehicles. To live there was often to be dependent on rides. Buses, cars owned by parents or friends, and the shifting improvisations of transportation that shape young people's lives. If a bus was missed or a plan changed, a ride from someone could look like a practical answer rather than a dramatic gamble. A van, especially, was not inherently suspicious. Tradesmen had vans. Families had vans. Men drove vans for work, for hauling, for camping, for any number of ordinary reasons. That very ordinariness became part of the danger. One of the case's most chilling dimensions is how ordinary infrastructure and ordinary objects were turned into instruments of domination. Roads that symbolized freedom became routes of abduction. A vehicle built for transport became a chamber of confinement. Tools, which belong in the human imagination to labor and repair, were transformed into the vocabulary of torture. This inversion is central to the case's context because it reveals something about the killer's worldview. They did not simply lash out when opportunity presented itself. They planned to exploit the normal structure of everyday life. Their crimes drew power from disguise, from blending into the visual field of Southern California until the moment when control could be seized. The social context of 1979 matters too. America in the late 70s was living through a period of unease and drift. The optimism of earlier decades had thinned. There was a growing public awareness of serial murder, sexual violence, and stranger danger. But the understanding remained uneven, scattered, and often distorted by sensational media coverage. Some famous cases had already entered national consciousness. Yet there was still no widespread, coherent cultural framework for grasping how organized sexual sadism could function in ordinary environments. Law enforcement, too, was still developing the methods, language, and psychological understanding that would later become more familiar in serial crime investigations. People knew bad things happened. They did not always know how methodical those bad things could be, or how predators could rehearse, prepare, and refine their violence over time. The public imagination still often separated monsters from normal life too sharply. Monsters were supposed to look monstrous. They were supposed to live in shadows so obvious that any decent person could spot them. But Bittaker and Norris were not cinematic apparitions. They were men with records, histories, and obvious inner damage, yes. But they were also capable of moving through daily life without announcing the full scale of what they intended. That gap between appearance and intention is part of the social context that made cases like this so difficult for communities to absorb. Southern California was also a place where runaways and vulnerable youth could disappear into the margins more easily than in smaller communities. A teenager being out overnight might not immediately bring the full machinery of alarm crashing down. Family conflict, movement between friends' houses, hitchhiking, partying, beach gatherings, odd jobs, strained homes. All of these were part of the ecology of youth life. Some girls had stable families who would panic the moment they failed to return. Others lived in forms of instability that made their absence slower to identify, slower to prioritize, easier for authorities or outsiders to misread. Predators exploit not only physical vulnerability, but social vulnerability. They choose victims whose absence they believe may take longer to trace, whose lives they imagine are less protected by immediate institutional attention, whose movement through the city is already partially untracked. This is one of the cruelest truths behind crimes against teenage girls. The world often asks them to move through danger with grace while offering them no equal guarantee that if they vanish, the danger will be recognized quickly enough. The cultural atmosphere around young women in the 70s intensified this imbalance. Girls were scrutinized and dismissed in nearly the same breath. If they hitchhiked, accepted rides, went out late, or moved through the city on their own, They could later be judged for those very actions, as though ordinary adolescent movement somehow dissolved the responsibility of the men who preyed on them. That moral ugliness does not begin in the courtroom. It begins in social expectations, in the habit of making female vulnerability seem like carelessness instead of a condition imposed by a predatory world. In the Toolbox Killers case, the victims were teenage girls, and that fact cannot be separated from the context of the crimes. Their youth did not merely make them targets in a practical sense, it made them targets in the killer's imagination. Adolescence contains a particular mixture of dependence and autonomy. Teenagers are old enough to be out in the world, young enough to still trust parts of it they should not have to distrust. They are testing freedom without possessing the full power to command it. They move through public life in ways that can leave them exposed to older men who understand exactly how little room a young girl may have to resist once control shifts. Bittaker and Norris hunted inside that imbalance. The fact that they worked as a pair deepened the danger. Paired killers occupy a different psychological space from solitary offenders. They create an internal social world in which fantasy is reinforced instead of checked, in which one man's hesitation can be mocked away by the other, and one man's imagination can be sharpened by another's approval. Evil in pairs can become practical. One man drives, one watches. One talks, one waits. One dominates while the other manages the conditions of domination. The partnership does not merely double the threat. It stabilizes it. It allows violence to become routine, collaborative, and more deliberate than it might be in a lone offender whose fantasies must constantly battle his own isolation. The context of the Toolbox Killers case therefore includes not just California geography or late 1970s culture, but the chemistry of two damaged, predatory men finding in each other not restraint but permission. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris did not stumble into each other like ordinary acquaintances whose worst impulses happened to align for a moment. Their association intensified what was already rotten in each of them. Both men had criminal backgrounds. Both had histories that reflected disregard for law, boundaries, and the humanity of others. Yet criminal history alone does not explain the horror of what they became together. Plenty of offenders do not become systematic sadists. What matters here is that the two men cultivated a shared project of predation. That word matters. Project. It suggests planning, forethought, emotional investment, and a willingness to turn another person's suffering into a goal. Their crimes were not only sexually violent, they were structured around domination. That distinction is crucial because it helps explain why the case has endured in criminal history with such singular dread. The murders were not merely about eliminating victims after assault. They were about control prolonged and deepened. They were about forcing pain into the center of the experience. That degree of sadism does not arise only from opportunity. It arises from internal permission, rehearsal, and the belief that another human life can be converted into a private theater of power. The California setting made that theater mobile. The van gave the killers a contained environment. The roads gave them access. The city's scale gave them cover. The victim's youth gave them the leverage they wanted. This is how context operates in a case like this. It is not background wallpaper. It is the web of conditions that allowed intention to move. One must also remember how law enforcement culture of the era shaped the early understanding of such crimes. The late 1970s were a period when criminal profiling and the study of serial offenders were growing, but still not institutionalized in the way they later would be. Investigators could recognize brutality, but the frameworks for understanding patterned sadistic behavior across jurisdictions and victim types were still developing. Public databases, rapid coordination, and the broader cultural literacy around serial crime that later decades would develop were far less mature. This meant that victims could be seen first as isolated tragedies rather than as part of a linked structure of predation. It meant that young missing persons, especially girls or runaways, could fall into the cracks between family alarm, police procedure, and public attention. In a huge region like Southern California, Those cracks were wide enough to swallow time, and time is often the first ally of predators. Every delayed connection, every assumption that a girl had simply left, every bureaucratic pause before panic becomes institutional gave men like Bittaker and Norris more room to operate. Yet it would be too simple to say the case belonged only to failures of systems. It also belonged to the emotional climate of fear that was beginning to develop in American cities. People were starting to sense that the old assumptions about public safety were less reliable than they once seemed. Parents worried more. Teenagers were warned more often. News reports about violent crime accumulated. But fear by itself is not protection. Sometimes fear merely makes communities reactive, judgmental, and chaotic. What was needed, and too often absent, was not generalized anxiety, but precise recognition that predatory men could move through ordinary life in pairs. In vehicles, in neighborhoods, in broad California darkness, selecting victims who looked briefly unguarded and converting that moment into catastrophe. The toolbox killers emerged from that gap between the vague public fear of crime and the specific reality of organized sexual torture and murder. They belonged to a historical moment when the country had started to realize that certain forms of violence were more systematic and more intimate than it had wanted to believe. The context is also moral. Cases like this reveal not only what offenders are, but what societies fail to see in time. Southern California's dreamlike reputation, with its light, beauty, and self-invented glamour, made the underside harder to absorb. People like narratives of sunny places. They like to imagine danger as an exception to the mood, rather than something the mood can conceal. But sunshine can be a mask. So can sprawl. So can a van on a boulevard. So can two men who know how to appear casual long enough to be invited 1 inch past the threshold of trust. When later generations look back at the Toolbox Killers case and shudder at the details, they sometimes miss this part. The horror did not descend onto California from somewhere outside it. It was grown inside ordinary freedoms, ordinary roads, ordinary gaps in attention, ordinary habits of trusting that the world will remain within recognizable bounds. That is why the context matters so much. It explains how teenage girls in the summer of 1979 could still be moving through Los Angeles County with the ordinary confidence of youth while, at the same time, two men were driving those same roads with an entirely different map in their heads. A map of vulnerability, isolation, and control. One side of that map was the public California everyone knew. The other side was private, predatory, and unspeakably cruel. The case began where those two maps overlapped. That overlap is the true setting of the story, not just Southern California, not just 1979, but a civilization confident enough in its surfaces to leave its daughters navigating a darkness it did not yet know how to describe. By the time the summer of 1979 had settled over Southern California, the victims in the Toolbox Killers case were still living inside the ordinary rhythms of girlhood. That is the first truth that has to be protected in any honest telling of this story. Before the headlines, before the courtroom language, before the case became a permanent fixture in the darkest archive of American crime, there were girls with voices, habits, tempers, anxieties, favorite clothes, unfinished plans, ordinary arguments, and the small, vivid concerns that make up a young life. They were not born to become symbols of brutality. They were not created for the sake of this story. They were daughters, friends, students, teenagers standing at that unstable threshold between dependence and independence, where the world begins to open and, too often, begins to threaten in the same motion. So when we come to what might be called the victim's statement, we are not dealing with a single courtroom testimony delivered after the fact. In a case like this, the victim's statement exists in fragments. In what the girls said before they vanished, in how they moved through the world, in the fears they voiced, in the assumptions they still carried about safety, in the evidence of their humanity left behind in bedrooms, family memories, and last sightings. It also exists in the more terrible sense, in the suffering later reconstructed by investigators, prosecutors, and forensic evidence, where what could not be spoken in life had to be understood through the traces of violence left on the body and in the killer's own records. That is what makes Part 3 so difficult in this case. The victims were denied the chance to complete their own statements. Their lives were interrupted so absolutely that later generations have had to piece together their presence from the fragments left behind. Yet those fragments matter enormously, because they are the only defense against the killer's preferred logic, which is always to reduce a person to what was done to her. To resist that reduction is the first duty of the narrative. The girls targeted by Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were teenage girls. And that age matters in every direction at once. It matters because adolescence is a time of becoming, a time when a person is both intensely herself and still unfinished. A teenage girl can seem grown in one moment and heartbreakingly young in the next. She can argue like an adult, dream like a child, and trust like someone who has not yet fully learned how predatory the world can be. Adults often misread this stage of life. They demand maturity from girls when it suits them and dismiss them as naive when they are harmed. But the truth is more complicated and more painful. Young girls live inside conditions they did not build. They are told to be careful, told to be polite, told to be wary, told not to provoke, told not to trust too much, and then somehow expected to navigate public life without making one wrong calculation in a world crowded with men who have practiced deception far longer than they have practiced caution. The victim's statement in the Toolbox Killer's case begins there. In that impossible burden, it begins in the fact that the girls were living the ordinary freedoms of youth in a culture that made those freedoms dangerous, while treating the danger as their responsibility to manage. One can imagine their last ordinary hours with painful ease, a room half cleaned, a friend expected later, a ride needed, a family conversation left unresolved because there would be time to finish it tomorrow, summer clothes thrown over a chair, music playing somewhere in the background, the everyday looseness of July and August in California. When the heat lingers and time feels less structured, when young people stay out later and move through neighborhoods, beaches, parking lots, and streets with the feeling that one more stop, one more ride, one more hour is part of the season's natural generosity. The girls in this story were still inside that ordinary life before evil cut across it. That matters because the killers did not choose women in full command of the world's protections. They chose girls whose youth itself could be exploited. Girls whose age made them easier to approach, easier to underestimate, easier to isolate, easier to overpower. In that sense, the victim's statement is already written into the selection of the victims. The crimes say something about the girls, not because they were responsible for what happened, but because the killer's choices reveal exactly what they were hunting: vulnerability, youth, and the temporary solitude that comes when a teenage girl is between one safe place and another. The known victims included Lucinda Schaefer, Jacqueline Gilliam, Shirley Ledford, and Andrea Hall, and every one of those names deserves to be spoken as a full life first, not as an item in a sequence of atrocities. Lucinda Schaefer was only 16. At 16, life is still full of rehearsals. One is rehearsing adulthood without having arrived there, rehearsing confidence, rehearsing romance, rehearsing selfhood. The future still feels broad enough to survive mistakes. A ride can seem like a practical answer rather than a doorway to annihilation. Jacqueline Gilliam was 15, an age so young that even writing it forces the mind to stop and measure the disproportion between the victim and the men who targeted her. 15 belongs to school corridors, awkward laughter, family rules, arguments about where one is going and when one will be home. It belongs to a life still being held close to the orbit of childhood. Andrea Hall was 18. Old enough to seem outwardly independent, but still standing at the edge of adult life, still part of the fragile age when freedom and danger brush against each other constantly. Shirley Ledford was 16, another girl whose life should have been occupied by the small dramas and excitements of youth, rather than by the unimaginable cruelty that waited for her. These girls were not interchangeable, and that is part of the tragedy. Serial and paired killers depend on interchangeability in their own minds. They look at victims and see types, opportunities, bodies, circumstances. They erase individuality before they ever commit the act. Because dehumanization is the emotional groundwork for sadism, to recover the victim's statement is to fight that erasure. It is to insist that each girl had her own interior life, her own fears and humor, her own way of speaking, her own sense of what the night ahead would hold. We do not always possess enough archival detail to reconstruct those interior lives fully, and honesty requires admitting that. But absence does not mean emptiness. The historical record may be uneven. But no missing detail gives the killers permission to replace the girl's humanity with spectacle. The victim's statement also survives in the ordinary signs families later remember with unbearable precision. The last outfit, the last phone call. The way a girl closed the door behind her, the little tone of impatience or excitement in her voice. The assumption, so ordinary it barely rises to consciousness, that she will be back. These things are often the true opening chapters of murder cases. Though they do not look dramatic at the time, they look like life. Only later do they begin to burn in memory with a different light. A parent recalls the exact time of evening. A friend remembers where they were supposed to meet. A sister remembers a casual sentence that suddenly becomes the last sentence. These memory fragments are part of the victim's statement because they preserve the life interrupted. They tell us what the victim still expected from the world. She expected continuity. She expected the night to continue in the usual way. She expected home, or the next destination. Or simply another morning. The killers stole not only life, but expectation. They turned ordinary continuation into silence. In cases of sexual sadism, the victim's statement acquires an even heavier burden because so much of what happened was meant to destroy personhood itself. Sadistic offenders do not merely inflict pain. They attempt to reorder reality so that the victim exists only as an object within the offender's control. Fear becomes useful to them. Pleading becomes stimulating to them. Resistance becomes something to punish. In such cases, every effort to remember the victim as a full human being is an act of moral refusal. The girls would have spoken during their captivity. They would have pleaded, reasoned, cried out, negotiated, protested, and tried in whatever ways they could to survive. We do not need to reproduce the intimate content of all that suffering to understand its meaning. The meaning is clear enough. These were girls fighting for their lives in the presence of men who had already decided that the girls' pain and terror were not obstacles, but part of the desired experience. That is what makes the case so spiritually revolting. The victim's statement inside such a crime is the statement of a human being insisting, even under absolute domination, that she is still alive, still worthy of mercy, still someone whose fear should matter. The killers answered that statement with contempt, yet the statement remains morally powerful precisely because of that contempt. It reveals the scale of what was being violated. Shirley Ledford's case occupies a particularly harrowing place in this history because the killers recorded part of the ordeal, leaving behind an artifact so appalling that it would later traumatize those forced to hear it. One must tread carefully here. The purpose of mentioning that recording is not to sensationalize suffering, but to understand how, in this case, the victim's statement survived in a uniquely terrible form. Shirley's voice, her fear, her attempts to endure and respond, were captured by the men who harmed her. They intended that recording as part of their own gratification, part of the architecture of domination, yet history transformed it into something else as well. Evidence of what they were, evidence of what she endured. Evidence so powerful that even hardened legal professionals reportedly found it shattering. There is an almost unbearable cruelty in the fact that one of the clearest surviving victim statements in this case comes through a medium created by the killers themselves. They tried to turn her voice into a trophy. Instead, it became one of the strongest indictments of them. Still, The emotional cost of that fact remains enormous. To know that a girl's suffering survived in sound while her life did not is to feel the case's obscenity at a deeper level. The victim's statement here is not metaphorical. It is literally a human voice trapped in evidence, carrying terror across time. And yet even that must not be allowed to eclipse the fuller truth that Shirley was more than the final hours captured there. She was a 16-year-old girl with a life before the recording, before the van, before the men who chose to reduce her to an instrument of their sadism. The same is true for the other girls. We know some things and not enough others. We know their ages, some circumstances of disappearance, the broad shape of what was done. But behind every sparse biographical detail is the full, lost density of a life. Lucinda Schaefer at 16 had likely already begun to imagine what adulthood might feel like. Jacqueline Gilliam at 15 was still in the near orbit of childhood, still belonging more naturally to school days than to crime files. Andrea Hall at 18 stood at the age when adulthood is legally near but emotionally still fragile and incomplete. These girls had favorite things, private embarrassments, moods, and hopes. Their lives had texture. The killers tried to replace that texture with fear. Any responsible narrative must do the opposite. The victim's statement also exists in the social position these girls occupied. Teenage girls are often not granted full authority, even over their own fear. They are trained to second-guess themselves, to worry about appearing rude or difficult, to accommodate, to soften refusals, to assume that they can manage situations without escalating them. Predators understand this better than most decent people do. They exploit the social education of girls. A van slows. A question is asked. A ride is offered. The girl is placed in the narrow corridor between politeness and instinct, between inconvenience and danger. She may hesitate. She may tell herself she can get out quickly if needed. She may not want to seem dramatic. These are not personal failings. They are the products of a world that trains girls to navigate male unpredictability without ever giving them equal power. The victim's statement, therefore, is also collective. It belongs not only to these individual girls, but to the broader condition of girlhood under threat. Their story says what so many girls cannot safely say in time. That vulnerability is not consent. That politeness is not invitation. That youth should not have to function as its own bodyguard. As we imagine the victims before the crimes, we should also imagine the ways they still trusted the future. Young people live in futures automatically. They assume plans can be rescheduled, apologies made tomorrow, conflicts resolved next week. They buy clothes for later in the summer. They talk about things they will do next month. This future-mindedness is one of youth's quiet beauties, and in murder cases, it becomes one of the deepest wounds. The victim's statement is often written in those unfinished futures. The girls did not know they were nearing the edge of their lives. They thought they were moving through one ordinary segment of time toward whatever came next. That innocence, even in girls who had already known hardship, deserves to be protected in the telling. Innocence does not mean ignorance of all danger. Many teenage girls know perfectly well that the world can be threatening. Innocence in this sense means simply the right to continue existing, the right not to have one's ordinary human expectations turned into fatal miscalculations by people actively hunting them. In the Toolbox Killers case, the victim's statement also includes the statement made by their bodies after death. This is a hard truth, but a necessary one, because the girls were denied life and speech. Forensic evidence had to testify where they could not. Wounds, bindings, patterns of injury, timelines, and physical evidence all became the language through which the investigation learned what the victims had undergone. This is one of the bleakest dimensions of homicide work. The body becomes witness. It tells the truth because the killers have made living testimony impossible. In sadistic murder cases, that truth is often more dreadful than ordinary speech can bear. Yet the forensic record, however clinical, is also part of the victim's statement. It says this happened It says someone did this deliberately. It says the suffering was real. Not imagined, not exaggerated, not cinematic invention. It says the girls were here. They lived, they fought. They died, and the world is now obligated to answer. What remains, finally, is the moral core of this section. The victim's statement in the Toolbox Killers case is the statement of teenage girls whose lives were seized by men committed to domination, but whose humanity endured beyond that seizure. It endures in their names, in the grief of those who loved them, in the evidence that exposed the killers, in the public horror that followed, and in the continuing duty to tell the story without surrendering it to the killer's appetite for spectacle. Lucinda Schaefer, Jacqueline Gilliam, Andrea Hall, Shirley Ledford. Each name carries more life than the crime allowed to remain visible. Each name pushes back against the reduction the killers intended. If one listens closely, the victim's statement in this case says many things at once. It says these girls were young and real and should have had years ahead of them. It says they did not exist to satisfy male cruelty. It says their fear mattered, their voices mattered, their resistance mattered. It says the world that failed to protect them must at least tell the truth about what was taken. And perhaps most painfully, it says that before the van doors shut, before the city went on without noticing fast enough, before evidence replaced breathing life, these were simply girls moving through California nights with the ordinary expectation that they were still entitled to a future. That expectation was violated with monstrous intent. But the humanity inside it, the trust, the youth, the unfinished self, remains the most important statement of all. The incident in the Toolbox Killers case did not unfold as a single eruption of violence on one night in one place. It developed across a sequence of nights in Southern California during the summer of 1979, each crime following the same dreadful logic more confidently than the last. What made the incident so terrifying was not only the brutality itself, but the sense of method. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were not improvising in panic. They were working through a plan, refining a pattern, learning from each act of domination how to make the next one easier to control. The roads of Los Angeles County and its surrounding areas became the outer edge of that pattern. Their van became its center. The girls they targeted were approached in ordinary public spaces, the kind of places where a teenager might pause, accept a ride, or assume that two men in a vehicle were just another piece of the city's nighttime machinery. The incident, then, begins not with the violence already underway, but with approach. With selection, with the moment when ordinary California night met deliberate predation and had no outward sign, yet of how catastrophic that meeting would become. Bittaker and Norris had chosen their hunting ground well. Southern California's vastness gave them access to beaches, parking lots, quiet roads, and stretches of the urban fringe where movement after dark could become thinly witnessed. They were able to drive through the city and its outskirts, looking for teenage girls who appeared briefly isolated, girls between destinations, girls in need of transportation, girls young enough and vulnerable enough that a brief exchange through the window of a van could become the first step into captivity. The details that later emerged would show that the two men were not relying on chance alone. They had discussed what they wanted to do. They had obtained and outfitted the van. They had equipped themselves with instruments meant to dominate, restrain, and injure. The incident, in its deepest sense, began long before the first victim was physically overpowered. It began with preparation. With fantasy becoming logistics, that decision turned every public road they traveled into a possible staging ground. The first known victim, Lucinda Schaefer, disappeared in late June 1979. She was 16 years old. And like the girls who would follow, she entered the killer's path not because she had done anything extraordinary, but because she was living an ordinary young life in a city whose freedoms came attached to risk. The sequence that led her into the van almost certainly unfolded with the deceptive simplicity common to predatory abduction. A vehicle slows. A conversation begins. A ride is offered. The threshold between public life and private danger is crossed in seconds. That threshold is one of the most haunting aspects of the incident because it is so narrow and so ordinary looking. It is not marked by thunder or obvious spectacle. It is marked by the door opening, the body moving closer. The momentary assumption that the world still belongs to its usual rules. Once inside, those rules vanished. Lucinda was taken into a space already designed to strip her of options. The van was not merely a vehicle. It was an environment built to convert movement into captivity. On the roads outside, California continued as usual. Cars passed. Lights changed. Summer evening stretched on. Inside the van, control shifted completely. There's a particular horror in crimes committed in motion. A fixed room, at least it belongs somewhere. A moving vehicle becomes placeless. It takes the victim out of the world she knows, while leaving the world itself apparently unchanged. The city continues. The victim is already being removed from it. In Lucinda's case, the details later reconstructed through evidence suggested that the violence escalated inside that mobile isolation. She was overpowered, assaulted, and ultimately killed. Her body would later be found discarded in a remote area, which reveals another essential feature of the incident. Bittaker and Norris did not simply kill, they transported, relocated, and abandoned. Using geography to extend control even after death, the first murder was not the end of the incident. It was the first full rehearsal of a method. That is what makes this case so chilling in retrospect. The killers did not stop. Instead, the success of the first abduction seems to have confirmed for them that the system they had built could work. The van functioned. The city did not stop them. The victim disappeared into their private world and then into the landscape. That terrible lesson led directly into the next crimes. In July, Jacqueline Gilliam, only 15 years old, became another victim again. What is striking is how the incident would have looked from the outside in its opening moments. A girl in Southern California, a pair of older men in a van, an encounter that may have seemed unremarkable to anyone glimpsing it from a distance. The city's entire social order depends on the ability of strangers to remain strangers without constant panic. Predators exploit that dependence. Bittaker and Norris were able to move through public space because public space does not come pre-labeled with intent. The incident with Jacqueline followed the same terrible inward motion as the first. Contact, isolation, overpowering, then prolonged violence within the van or in another private setting. With each victim, the pattern became more entrenched. The killers were no longer testing a fantasy, they were inhabiting it. The collaboration between them deepened the incident's horror. Paired killers divide labor in ways that make resistance harder. One can drive while the other threatens. One can restrain while the other prepares the next act. One can watch while the other performs violence. Most disturbing of all, each can reinforce the other's cruelty. There is no lonely pause in which conscience must face itself. There is always another presence in the room or in the van. Approving, assisting, escalating. That mutual reinforcement was one of the central engines of the incident. It transformed the crimes from isolated acts of murder into a shared ritual of domination. The killers were not only harming victims, they were participating together in a closed system that fed on terror. By the time Andrea Hall was abducted in September 1979, the pattern had matured further. Andrea was 18. Slightly older than some of the other victims, but still painfully young compared with the men who hunted her. Her age underscores another truth about the incident. The killers were not targeting children in the obvious, immediate sense, nor fully mature women who might present different challenges. They were selecting teenage girls on the edge of adulthood, girls who moved independently enough to be accessible and yet remained vulnerable enough to be overpowered physically and socially. Andrea's abduction likely began, like the others, in the outer ring of normal life, a ride, A roadside conversation, the split second in which one decides whether to trust. That repetition is itself horrifying. The killers had discovered how little the outside world needed to change in order for catastrophe to begin. There was no need for elaborate theater. The ordinary appearance of a van and a simple offer could do the opening work. Once Andrea was inside, the pattern of captivity resumed. Assault, torture, and murder followed, then removal of the body. The city and its outskirts were being used as a sequence of doors. First access, then concealment, then disposal. Nothing about the incident was impulsive anymore. It had become an operating system. Yet the most infamous and emotionally devastating portion of the incident came with the abduction of Shirley Ledford in October 1979. By then, Bittaker and Norris had grown even more confident, more methodical, and more invested in the sadistic architecture of their crimes. Shirley was only 16. On the night she was taken, the ordinary world around her was still intact. There were streets, lights, other people not far away. There was still the outward appearance of urban life continuing as it always does, and yet that is the unbearable truth of these incidents. Proximity to normality does not protect against predators who know how to create private captivity inside public space. Shirley entered the van under circumstances that, from a distance, may have looked no different from hundreds of other rides taken by young people in Southern California. But this time, the killers were not content only to dominate and murder. They recorded part of what happened. That act changed the meaning of the incident in a lasting way. The recording was not incidental. It was part of the cruelty. It meant the killers wanted not only to harm, but to preserve the harm. To create a document of suffering for their own gratification. There is something especially revolting about that decision because it reveals the degree to which the crime had become ceremonial for them. The van was not merely a site of violence. It had become a stage. The victim's fear was not merely tolerated. It was collected. During Shirley's captivity, the violence reached a level that would later haunt investigators, prosecutors, and anyone forced to confront the contents of the tape. It is enough to say that she was subjected to prolonged terror, that her pleas and pain became part of the evidence, and that the men inside the van behaved with a level of calculated cruelty that stripped away any remaining illusion that these were crimes of passion or momentary frenzy. They were not. They were disciplined in the ugliest possible way. They were acts of domination extended on purpose. That is the true shape of the incident. The physical movement from street to van to remote disposal site was accompanied by a psychological movement from public identity to total control. Every victim was first a girl with a life outside the killer's grasp. Then she was transformed, within their logic, into material for sadism. That transformation is the heart of the crime. It is what separates murder from torture-driven predation. The killers were not merely eliminating witnesses to sexual assault. They were constructing private ordeals. The incident, therefore, had layers. First came the selection in public. Then the sealing off of the victim inside the van. Then restraint and assault. Then the deliberate infliction of pain and fear. Then murder. Then disposal. Then the return to ordinary roads. As though the city could absorb what had happened without visible disturbance. Each crime repeated those layers with variations. But the basic logic held. The van moved through California like a mobile threshold between one reality and another. From the outside, it was traffic. From the inside, it was a trap engineered for helplessness. There is also a temporal cruelty to the incident. These crimes occurred over months, not minutes, and that means the killers lived between offenses, carrying with them memory, planning the next act, discussing what they had done, deciding what to do again. The intervals matter because they reveal will. Nothing forced the men forward except desire. They woke up each day and continued being the people who had chosen this path. At some point, they prepared the van again, drove again, watched again, selected again. The incident was therefore not one continuous frenzy, but a series of chosen descents. Each descent required re-entry into the same moral void. That is what makes paired serial crimes so difficult to absorb. The repetition suggests a stability of evil that ordinary minds resist. We prefer to imagine monstrous acts as brief storms. Bittaker and Norris made theirs into routine from the victim's point of view. Though each incident would have felt like a catastrophic rupture from normal time. A summer evening or autumn night suddenly shattered, a stranger's offer becoming an irreversible mistake. The inside of the van replacing the entire known world, fear narrowing thought to immediate survival. Efforts to talk, plead, resist, or endure meeting men who had already decided that mercy had no place there. One of the most haunting truths in this case is that the victims would have entered the incident still believing, at least for some first stretch of time, that survival might be negotiated. Human beings negotiate instinctively when trapped. They try to humanize themselves to their captors. They look for a weak point, a delay, a chance to be spared. The killer's response to that ordinary human reaching out was to deepen domination. That is why the incident carries such lasting horror. It was not only violent, it was anti-human in a profound sense. Built around the rejection of every appeal to empathy, the sequence of crimes continued until the investigation finally closed in. But Part 4 belongs to the acts themselves, to the mechanics of how the summer and fall of 1979 were turned into a corridor of abduction, torture, and murder. Looking at the incident whole, one sees not isolated crimes but a pattern moving with terrible confidence through Southern California. A van cruises at night. 2 men search. A girl is found at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, with no visible warning strong enough to outweigh the ordinary logic of accepting a ride or entering conversation. The doors close. The city falls away. What follows is controlled, deliberate, and unspeakably cruel. The body is later discarded far from the first point of contact. Then the men return to traffic, to roads, to life's ordinary surfaces, carrying within the vehicle the memory of what they have done and the preparations for what they may do again. That is the incident in its fullest form. Not a single explosion of violence, but a repeated conversion of public freedom into private captivity, carried out by 2 men who learned to use California's mobility, anonymity, and ordinary social trust as instruments in one of the most brutal paired killer cases in American criminal history. In a case like the Toolbox Killer's murders, the crime scene did not begin as a single room discovered under a bright police light, neatly bounded and frozen in time. It emerged slowly, painfully, across parking lots, roadside drop sites, canyon edges, bits of forensic residue, missing person reports, and the terrible recognition that several separate disappearances might belong to one moving theater of violence. The first crime scenes were, in one sense, wherever the girls had last been seen alive: a sidewalk, a roadside, a stretch of Southern California night where ordinary movement dissolved into silence. But those spaces yielded almost nothing at first, beyond absence. Absence is one of the cruelest forms of evidence. It forces families to imagine too much and investigators to work with too little. A missing teenage girl leaves behind a room, a family, a set of expected destinations, and then a widening ring of confusion. Did she run away? Did she accept a ride? Did she go with someone she knew? Did something happen by chance? In ordinary cases, those questions buy time for the truth to surface. In predatory cases, that same uncertainty becomes a shield for the offender. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris exploited precisely that kind of delay. Their victims disappeared into a city and region large enough to swallow initial panic and make the first hours feel inconclusive rather than catastrophic. Yet the clues were there from the beginning. Even when no one could yet assemble them into a complete map, they lay in the pattern of the victims' ages, the timing of the disappearances, the geography of where bodies would later be found. and the traces left behind by men who thought movement and isolation would keep their crimes from ever cohering into a single narrative. Lucinda Schaefer's disappearance in June 1979 was one of the earliest dark openings in that narrative. She was 16, and like so many teenage girls moving through Southern California, she vanished first into the category of missing before she entered the harsher category of murdered. That delay matters because the emotional atmosphere of missing person cases often begins with denial. Families call friends, retrace plans, wait on late-night explanations that do not come. Police may initially treat the case through the familiar lens of adolescent unpredictability. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe she will turn up. Maybe there is some ordinary misunderstanding still in motion. But violence does not care how long bureaucracy takes to imagine it. Eventually, Lucinda's body was found in a remote area. The discovery changed everything, though not all at once. Now there was no longer only a missing girl. There was a homicide scene, or at least the remains of one stage of the homicide. Bodies found in remote outdoor locations tell investigators two things immediately. First, the place where the body lies is not always the place where the crime truly happened. Second, whoever placed it there believed distance, exposure, and time would corrupt the evidence. Lucinda's body had been discarded in a location chosen not for intimacy, but for concealment, a place where terrain itself might help erase sequence. That is how the first clues often arrive in mobile murder cases. The body is found far from the point of abduction, and the scene the investigators must read is already secondary, already compromised by weather, insects, animals, and the deliberate intentions of the killers. Even so, the body speaks, the position, the condition, the injuries, the clothing, the forensic material that remains. All of it becomes a form of testimony. In such cases, the victim's body is forced to do the work the living victim was denied the chance to do. Lucinda's remains signaled violence, concealment, and transportation. A teenage girl had not simply died in a remote place. She had been brought there by someone. That fact alone begins narrowing the moral field. Jacqueline Gilliam's case, following in July, deepened the shape of the emerging horror. She was only 15, and the youth of the victim mattered immediately. When teenage girls begin vanishing and later being found in circumstances suggestive of violent assault and disposal, pattern starts whispering before it can yet shout. But the whisper can be hard to hear in a large region where separate agencies, separate timelines, and separate assumptions keep crimes from being linked quickly. Jacqueline's body, like Lucinda's, became part of the growing constellation of clues. Each new victim gave the killers what they wanted in the short term: another erased life, another body distanced from the point of encounter, another family thrown into grief. But each victim also increased the forensic and geographic footprint of the crimes. Predators who repeat themselves often believe repetition proves mastery. In truth, repetition creates pattern. And pattern is one of investigation's sharpest tools. Age ranges, methods of abduction, disposal sites, timing, signs of sexual assault, evidence of restraint. All of these begin to gather weight once more than one case occupies the same shadow. Still, that gathering can take time. And time was the killer's ally in the summer of 1979. Southern California's sprawl complicated early investigative clarity. A body found in one area might not immediately be linked to a missing girl last seen miles away. A teenage victim might be initially categorized differently depending on what police knew of her circumstances. Families might receive uneven responses. Jurisdictions might not yet see the shared line running through the cases. The crime scene, then, was not merely outdoors or indoors. It was fragmented across administrative boundaries as much as geographic ones. The killers relied on distance, and distance is not only physical, it is also institutional. The van, which would later emerge as the real central crime scene, remained invisible for too long behind the outward randomness of missing girls and recovered bodies. Andrea Hall's disappearance in September further thickened the pattern. At 18, she was slightly older than Lucinda and Jacqueline, but still firmly within the age range that defined the killer's preferences. Her case added another body, another disposal site, another instance of a young female life abruptly collapsing into forensic reconstruction. By now, the early clues were no longer isolated. Investigators could begin to see that these were not simply unrelated acts of violence against young women in a large metropolitan region. There were connective tissues. Young female victims, sexual assault, remote dumping grounds, evidence suggesting restraint and control. Yet even then, the full architecture of the crimes remained hidden because the primary crime scene, the place where the domination occurred, was mobile and had not yet been discovered as such. That fact is crucial. The van allowed Bittaker and Norris to carry the central scene of violence with them. It contained traces that would matter later, but so long as it remained unlinked. Each body appeared as the aftermath of a separate nightmare rather than the output of a single moving chamber of torture. This is one of the reasons mobile serial crimes can remain opaque for longer than common sense would like to believe. The heart of the violence is enclosed, transportable, and outwardly ordinary. Investigators are left reading the echoes. And then came Shirley Ledford in October, and with her case, the hidden center of the investigation began. Finally, to move toward exposure. Shirley was 16. Her murder would become the most infamous in the case, not because the others mattered less, but because the killer's own arrogance and sadism produced evidence of unusual force. By the time Shirley was abducted, Bittaker and Norris had grown more emboldened, more certain of their method, and more grotesquely invested in documenting their own cruelty. The key piece of evidence was the recording they made during the attack. That tape would later become one of the most devastating clues in the entire case, but in the moment of the crime, it remained locked inside the offender's private world. Another object they believed belonged to them alone. The irony of many serial murder investigations is that the offender's narcissism often plants the seeds of his own exposure. Men who feel omnipotent begin preserving trophies, generating records, indulging rituals, and keeping evidence longer than prudence would permit. They start believing the world is too stupid or too slow to catch up. Bittaker and Norris, through that recording and through the physical traces they left in the van, were creating the very archive that would later condemn them. But investigators did not know that yet. What they knew first were bodies and disappearance routes and the terror of pattern. Bodies discarded in remote areas do not simply reveal violence, they reveal attitude. The placement of the dead says something about the killer's relationship to the victim even after death. In the Toolbox Killer's case, disposal sites suggested coldness, practicality, and a desire to put distance between the place of suffering and the place of discovery. A canyon edge, a roadside embankment, an isolated area outside the rhythm of daily foot traffic. Such places are chosen by men who want the body to be found late, degraded, or not at all. These are not panic decisions. They are logistical decisions. The killers believed geography could serve them. Southern California's outskirts, foothills, and remote patches became, in their minds, extensions of the van's privacy. They assumed the region was big enough to absorb the evidence if they kept scattering it. Yet every disposal site added to a map, investigators could trace routes, compare findings, and start asking what sort of offender would repeatedly transport young female victims into these kinds of locations. The crime scene was beginning to speak as a pattern of behavior. The first major investigative breakthrough did not come from the ground alone. It came from the social world around the killers, from the fact that predators often need audiences, confidants, or at least people close enough to glimpse their boasting. Bittaker and Norris, though capable of secrecy, were not men of perfect discipline. They carried within them the vanity common to sadists. They wanted to savor what they had done. They wanted, in some form, to relive it. That need would matter because one of the early keys to exposing them came through the attention of people who had encountered them and sensed enough wrongness to remember, even before the full forensic picture snapped into place. Their van mattered as a clue. It was not just any vehicle. It had a specific appearance, a specific type, and it had been seen in contexts that became increasingly suspicious once investigators began connecting the disappearances. A van is at once conspicuous and anonymous. It does not dissolve into the visual field the way a small sedan might, yet the sheer number of ordinary vans on California roads can make one specific van hard to isolate unless someone remembers details. Witness memory, then, became part of the early clue structure. A girl seen talking to men in a van, a vehicle in the vicinity, a description that lingers because something about it felt off. These are fragile clues at first, but once linked to bodies, they become more dangerous to the offenders. The eventual arrest did not happen because the perfect crime scene suddenly illuminated itself. It happened because the clues, physical, behavioral, and human, finally converged. Norris, who would later turn on Bittaker, became the human break in the wall. But before that betrayal fully reshaped the case, there were the first external clues that law enforcement could seize and test. The van, once identified, ceased being merely a vehicle of suspicion and became a potential forensic goldmine. Inside mobile crime scenes, offenders often carry their mistakes with them. Fibers, hair, blood traces, fingerprints, marks from restraints, tape residue, tools. The very enclosure that gives them control also traps evidence. Unlike an outdoor dump site, a vehicle preserves private contact. It accumulates the residue of domination. Once investigators moved toward the van as the true central scene, the logic of the murders changed. Now, the cases were no longer just connected by victim type and disposal pattern. They were connected by a physical chamber of violence. And within that chamber lay the most damning clue of all. Not only the forensic residue of multiple crimes, but the recorded evidence that revealed the nature of the offender's sadism with a force almost beyond bearing. Yet the clue that helped transform suspicion into certainty was not merely the existence of the tape, but what it implied about the whole structure of the case. A killer who records torture is a killer who believes he is untouchable. A killer who keeps such a recording is a killer who has begun to confuse secrecy with invulnerability. That arrogance is itself a clue, because it leads to hoarding, repetition, and the retention of incriminating objects. The tools found in connection with the case mattered as well, giving the eventual label its grim power. Tools are intimate clues because they show preparation. A man carrying restraints, implements, or objects suited to domination does not arrive at murder by accident. He arrives equipped. The presence of such items around Bittaker and Norris told investigators they were dealing not with spontaneous violence, but with designed violence. This distinction is essential to Part 5. The crime scene and initial clues did not reveal only who might have done it. They revealed what kind of minds had done it. Organized, predatory, sadistic, methodical, mobile. Those adjectives emerge not from psychological speculation alone, but from the evidence itself. The van, the tape, the tools, the remote body recoveries, the repeated targeting of teenage girls. The concealment mixed with trophy keeping. The case was teaching investigators how the killers thought. And one of the bleakest lessons was that the men had constructed a private world within public life, a world in which a California night, a teenage girl in need of a ride, and a common-looking van could be assembled into captivity before anyone outside understood what was happening. As the clues accumulated, the emotional climate of the investigation changed. What had begun as discrete griefs and scattered scenes hardened into the outline of one of the most brutal paired killer cases in American criminal history. Families who had first lived inside the agony of uncertainty now confronted something worse in one sense and clearer in another. A pattern. Detectives who may once have seen separate tragedies now saw a moving crime scene and a pair of men behind it. The bodies found in remote areas, the physical evidence of assault, the witness sightings, the van, the recording, the implements. All of it began to form one terrible picture. The crime scene was no longer fragmented. It had a center, and once that center was found, the initial clues that once seemed small, a remembered van, a body placed a certain way, a missing girl last seen in a particular area, suddenly glowed with new significance. That is how murder investigations often work at their most haunting. The truth is present in pieces long before it can be spoken whole. In the Toolbox Killer's case, those pieces were laid out across Southern California in summer and fall of 1979, in open land and hidden interiors. In the bodies of girls and the objects of men, in witness memory and offender vanity, the killers believed the city's scale and the private enclosure of their van would keep the whole thing forever broken into parts. Instead, slowly, the parts began to find one another. By the time investigators began to understand that the disappearances and murders of teenage girls in Southern California were not isolated tragedies, but chapters in one unfolding nightmare, the case had already entered its most infuriating phase. The dead were beginning to speak through evidence. The pattern was beginning to harden. The van, the age of the victims, the disposal sites, the violence itself, all of it was pushing toward a conclusion too terrible to ignore, and yet conclusions are not convictions. A detective can feel the shape of guilt long before the law can lock its hands around it. That is where Part 6 begins. In the widening gap between suspicion and proof, in the maddening territory where the killers are close enough to sense and still protected by the fog of incomplete evidence. Institutional caution and the old criminal advantages of secrecy, deception, and time. In the Toolbox Killer's case, the suspects were not anonymous phantoms drifting forever beyond reach. They were men with names, histories, habits, criminal records, weaknesses, egos, and a growing relationship to evidence that would eventually help destroy them. But before that collapse came the dead end. And the dead end in this story was not simple absence, it was overabundance without certainty. Too many clues to dismiss, not enough at first to close the fist. Too much evil visible in outline, not enough yet connected in a way the system could immediately use without risk of losing the whole case. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris emerged as suspects because their behavior, histories, and access aligned too closely with the pattern of the crimes to ignore. They were not the kind of men who drift through life without attracting concern. Both had criminal backgrounds. Both had already demonstrated contempt for boundaries and for the law. Both were old enough, experienced enough, and damaged enough to understand the value of intimidation and manipulation. Yet criminal history alone does not solve a murder case. Southern California in the late 1970s had no shortage of men with records, no shortage of predators, no shortage of possible candidates whenever teenage girls vanished and turned up dead. The task of investigation is not merely to feel revulsion in the right direction. It is to narrow revulsion into evidence. That process can be maddening when the offenders operate as a pair. Because paired offenders create both more witnesses to their own guilt and more layers of protection around it. One man can corroborate the other's lie. One can shift blame, one can remain silent while the other improvises. Each can rehearse the story with the other until it feels smooth. The presence of a second offender does not merely double the danger. It doubles the capacity to confuse, delay, and deflect. Bittaker and Norris had built their crimes around mobility, isolation, and concealment. Their van acted as the private center of the violence, a moving room beyond witness view. Their disposal of bodies in remote areas severed the place of death from the place of discovery. Their victims, teenage girls, were vulnerable not only physically but socially, because the first hours of disappearance often passed through the familiar, tragic filters of adolescence. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she is with friends. Maybe she will return. Predators love those maybe statements. Every maybe is time. Every maybe is another hour of heat, distance, and doubt between the victim and the truth. By the time investigators began seeing the pattern more clearly, that time had already accumulated. The suspects were growing more visible. But so too were the complications in building a case that could survive legal scrutiny. One of the central frustrations in this phase was that investigators were not chasing a single explosive clue, but trying to build coherence from a cluster of smaller certainties. Witnesses had seen a van. Some details aligned. Certain movements of the suspects looked wrong. The victims fit a repeated pattern. The injuries on the recovered bodies suggested sadistic, controlled violence rather than impulsive murder. The geography of the body dumps suggested transportation and planning. None of this was nothing. In fact, it was a great deal. But criminal cases, especially capital cases with multiple murders, do not allow emotion to stand in for linkage. Investigators had to transform suspicion into a chain. Every link needed weight. Every inference had to be tied to a person, an object, a statement, a trace, the dead end. Therefore, was not the absence of direction. It was the exhausting work of forcing direction into admissible shape. The suspects themselves were a study in contrast and overlap. Lawrence Bittaker carried a particular kind of chill. He had the emotional profile investigators often fear most in sadistic cases. Manipulative, detached, capable of treating violence not as a regrettable byproduct of impulse, but as a chosen form of power. Roy Norris, though no less guilty in moral terms, presented a different texture. Where Bittaker could seem colder, Norris appeared more vulnerable to pressure, more porous, less able to sustain a perfect front indefinitely. This difference would matter later, but during the investigation phase, it mostly created a double difficulty. Bittaker could project steadiness. Norris could shift, wobble, or muddy the waters. Together, they formed a pair in which one might give investigators emotional blanks and the other a moving target. Such dynamics make cases harder. Detectives must read not just evidence, but the chemistry between suspects. The fault lines of loyalty, fear, dominance, and self-preservation. Paired killers rarely remain psychologically equal forever. One often leads, one follows, though the follower's moral guilt remains absolute. The challenge is identifying how that imbalance can be used before the case collapses into mutual accusation too early or silence too long. In the Toolbox Killer's investigation, the dead end was as much about timing as substance. Detectives needed the suspects to come within legal and strategic reach without tipping them so early that they destroyed evidence, disappeared, or locked down completely. This is the ugly patience at the heart of many homicide investigations. Families want arrests. The public wants names. Investigators, if they are wise, want enough. Enough to search, enough to seize, enough to confront, enough to flip one man against the other, enough to stand in court and survive attack from defense attorneys who will exploit every weakness in sequence and every ambiguity in recollection. There is no virtue in arresting too soon if the result is acquittal. Yet there is agony in waiting while the faces of murdered girls sit in case files and the men who likely killed them still breathe ordinary air. That tension must have been severe in this case because the pattern suggested the killers were capable of repeating the crimes. Each delay risked not only frustration, but more blood. That pressure changes the emotional weather inside an investigation. Every misstep feels heavier when more lives may still be at stake. The first real wall investigators hit was the same wall many serial murder cases produce. They knew more in the moral sense than they could yet prove in the procedural one. They likely understood they were dealing with organized sexual sadists operating out of a vehicle. They had reason to focus on Bittaker and Norris, but reason is not enough. Courts do not convict on the phrase "it has to be them." The dead end was therefore built from legal caution, incomplete linkage, and the offender's own effort to remain just fragmented enough in the evidence. Their crimes had common elements, but common elements still had to be tied to common hands. The van became central to that effort, once it rose from background suspicion to focal point. The investigation tightened. A van is not just transportation in a case like this. It is a container of residue, hair, fibers, fingerprints, bodily fluids, tool marks, tape adhesive, damage patterns, impressions. All of these can accumulate inside an enclosed space in ways that later body disposal sites cannot erase.